Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Ice-Burgh podcast, your home for Pittsburgh Penguins news and analysis. You can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can catch us anywhere you get your podcast from. I'm your host, Nick Belsky, joined as always by Nick Warlott, and we got a great show for you guys today. The Pittsburgh Penguins last night, well, they said the roster freeze is coming up, and we think we need an extra piece, adding to their defensive depth with a familiar face that we'll talk about to lead off the show. And then we're going to play some Name That Stat Line to highlight some of the top players during this Penguins winning stretch where they are 7-2-1. And we wanted to say the hottest team in the league, but turns out there's a lot of teams in the NHL that are 7-2-1 over their last 10 games. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we will close things out by discussing our top 5 Pittsburgh Penguins unsung heroes. Let's get this started on the Tip of the Ice-Burgh. And we're kicking things off with the biggest news surrounding the Penguins, which is a trade. Or what? I was not expecting this. I don't think anybody was expecting this, but late last night, Elliot Friedman puts out the post. The Pittsburgh Penguins are reacquiring defenseman P.O. Joseph from the St. Louis Blues in exchange for future considerations. P.O. Joseph has 1 year, or this is his final year of his current contract, I believe making $950K, spent his first 4 years of his career as a member of the Pittsburgh Penguins after being part of the Phil Kessel trade that sent him to the Arizona Coyotes. What are your thoughts on the reacquiring of Pierre-Olivier Joseph?
I was surprised by it, and very just down the middle on it. I'm not upset at the trade, but I'm also not overjoyed by it. I think it doesn't come off as a retread necessarily, but it is just a weird, this is kind of surprising, but also not totally negative move. I think the biggest discussion with this trade genuinely might lay in what does that mean for the rest of the organization in terms of that position specifically of left shot defenseman. Like, what does this mean for Marcus Pettersson going forward? Clearly, the way we talked up, or at least I talked up, the possibility of some of the guys in the AHL right now, well, that's not happening because they just put someone right in front of them in line. There are more broad questions that I do think come with this trade, but when it comes to the trade on paper, I'm not mad at it because you've got a guy you have familiarity with, is loved in the locker room by literally everybody from the front office, coaching staff, teammates, media, all of it, you name it. Loved in the locker room, and we know what he's capable of. It's not like we're getting a bad player here. I'd be curious to see where he suits up, if he suits up, and who he plays with and where he goes. Like I said, I think this move brings with it a bunch of other questions, but at the same time, I'm not totally mad at it, just surprised.
Yeah, I mean, the trade itself hurts absolutely nothing. Future considerations is basically nothing. And first and foremost, the Blues and the Penguins, this is now their third trade in the last 6 months. I mean, you know the Kevin Hayes stuff from draft weekend, and then there was the other exchange to help them, the St. Louis Blues, that, mind you, with their entire offer sheet situation with Philip Broberg and Dylan Holloway. And now we get this where, again, there were some people that said, this is bad news for Marcus Pettersson. To me, this is just the long-awaited replacement for losing John Ludwig for nothing before the season started, because the Penguins, they wanted that extra defenseman that had NHL experience, and they realized earlier this week they were one injury away from playing Nathan Clerman on the defensive lineup. So I think this is just to bolster the depth. I don't think this is a move that they made to say, well, we need to replace Marcus Pettersson now. I think it was more just, hey, we need to make sure that we have our ducks in a row in case we sustain multiple injuries to the back end, because it's one injury with Marcus Pettersson, but technically two, because you would think that Jack St. Ivany would be that first name called up, but he's on the shelf week to week with an injury as well. So it's just a depth move that, again, when you bring in a guy that's familiar, when you bring in a guy that's well-liked in the locker room, and a guy that, let's look at it this way, a guy that if you do what you did with Cody Ceci, could probably be pretty productive for you. Whereas Cody Ceci was being jammed into the wrong role in Toronto. If you bring him in, you let him play third line minutes, he's probably going to be pretty good for you. And that's what I think of P.O. Joseph. I think he's a guy that last year at times was kind of force-fed into a first pairing role with Kris Letang that he just didn't fit in. So if you allow him to play those third pairing minutes, maybe be your seventh defenseman as like a Chad Ruhwedel-esque role, I think P.O. Joseph could fit fine in one of those roles, and certainly as an injury replacement.
Yeah, like I said, I'm certainly not upset at this move. I think for the Penguins, I would have just at least expected something fresh, because this is a team in a weird situation, just looking for the reclamation projects. And P.O. Joseph doesn't necessarily strike anyone as a reclamation project, but I mean, Kyle Dubas and Doug Armstrong have a long-standing relationship. So the fact that a move between these two happened again, regardless of the teams, makes a ton of sense. So, and plus the Blues did just get Cam Fowler from the Ducks, so they kind of, whenever I was writing about that trade, actually, I noted that that essentially pushes P.O. Joseph out of the lineup. They're adding a much more a more veteran left shot defenseman into the lineup. That's just going to push P.O. Joseph straight out. I think the unfortunate part for P.O. genuinely is the fact that he just isn't playing with his brother anymore.
Yeah, that they made such a big deal out of that in the offseason.
And it was really cool. And it was cool seeing them play together for 20-something games. I forget. I think they assisted, or I think P.O. assisted on one of Matthews' goals, if I'm not mistaken, early in the year. They just did, like 48 hours ago. The NHL just posted that video of those two doing the JCPenney holiday photo thing with the Winter Classic jerseys. 48 hours later, P.O.'s off the team.
Yeah,
so one of those just images that precede unfortunate events, but. Still, I think in general, it's not like he's going to a unfamiliar situation. Joseph is going to come in. He's going to recognize everybody from top to bottom and pretty quickly probably find a role, regardless of if it is seventh defenseman in the lineup. Who knows who he pushes out? That's what I'm most curious to see. Does this mean Pickering is going to get a rest? Does this mean Matt Grzelcyk or Ryan Graves are going to get scratched again? Also, like we mentioned that Marcus Pettersson's on IR, correct. We also mentioned last episode, how much longer will he be here after he comes back?
Yeah.
So now you have the extra face there for that move if it comes, because I saw that get talked about on Twitter quite a bit too, was to essentially seal the deal on a Pettersson trade. Not quite, but that deal was also sealed weeks ago.
Yeah, I think that no matter what happens this year, it feels like Marcus Pettersson is probably out the door. Unless the Penguins continue to play at the pace that they're playing that right now for the next, 2 months, which would be miraculous. I mean, if they could play, 700 hockey, 7-2-1 in their last, 7, whatever that ends up being in win percentage. If they can play that for the next 2 months, yeah, they're probably going to be in the top 3 in the Metro. And at that point, you probably don't trade Marcus Pettersson because you believe that you can go much further than just making the playoffs. But again, that is as much as I'd love to see it, and I hope this is an old take exposed, I doubt you're going to play 7-2-1 hockey for 2 whole months here leading up to the trade deadline. So barring that, I think Marcus Pettersson is gone. And I don't think this move had anything to do with that move. I truly just think this is we've been looking for a replacement from the John Ludwig waiver claim for a while now. With the injuries that we've sustained, we're not quite willing to go with a guy like Nathan Clerman, who hasn't played an NHL game yet, with a guy like Philip Kral, who has not played a lot of NHL time yet. We're going to go with a guy that we know, a guy that, like you mentioned, big locker room guy, which is a nice feather in the cap. It's a nice little reward for the guys in the locker room for playing as well as they have, is they get one of their friends back in P.O. Joseph. And while it does kind of sting for him that, he doesn't get to play with his brother anymore, I'm sure that he's happier moving back to the Penguins than if he was traded anywhere else.
Yeah, especially since the Blues kind of gave him just a 1-year deal. It was, here's 1 year, you're still not a UFA at the end of it, so there's another situation the Penguins will have to figure out. But again, that'll be an easy one because it's P.O. Joseph. It's not like he is an elite, high-level offensive defenseman. He knows his role, he'll play his role, and an RFA contract won't be hard. He's on a UFA for another 2 years still, it looks like.
He's only 25 years old.
Oh man, and that's the other bonus. Like we mentioned, he's been around this organization for quite a while. If anything, him going to St. Louis was a bit of a speed bump. Just, he wasn't playing his best hockey there either. Really, if you look at the numbers, but I mean, St. Louis is also in a weird situation where they are trying to just go for it, get everything they can to go for it now, and they have not been afraid to play hardball. And this is another example of that, but just in a much minor way of, hey, we're trading you away from your brother. Sorry, bye. After 23 games.
Yeah.
Again, it's a small example, but the St. Louis Blues are doing everything they can to build a winner. Picking up Cam Fowler and pushing P.O. Joseph out the door is one way of doing it. Those 2 offer sheets over the summer were another way of doing it. And then hiring Jim Montgomery days after he got fired from Boston, another way of doing it. St. Louis has a plan, and maybe P.O. Joseph just wasn't part of it, but again, he's coming to a familiar place. It's nothing. It's not ideal. It's not ever ideal to get traded, especially away from a close family member like that. But you're going to a familiar place. There won't be too much of a disruption otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, you could essentially call Kris Letang another family member that's close. I mean, I think it was Jeff Taylor of the Fly Penguins Fly Game Day podcast yesterday that whenever I reacted to the trade, he said, I'm sure he still has a room available at the Letang household, and he's probably not wrong.
Probably not. I mean, those two get along super well. I've seen them speak French to each other, have arguments in French with each other in the locker room, and friendly arguments, obviously, but they have a close connection. They have a close relationship. It'll be, like I said, nothing hurt. P.O. Joseph's going to go to a familiar place. And have they played the Blues yet? I forget now. Well, he's got a couple opportunities to still play against his brother in the same season.
Yeah.
That'll be a fun little stat for the stat heads to find of just when's the last time a player was able to play with and against his brother in the same season.
Sometimes stats can get so narrowly focused that it's crazy. And you're like,
that's one
oh,
of the
wow,
ones.
I didn't even know that, that was a stat, and now this person's leading. That's what we get with Crosby almost every single game. It's like, oh, by the way, that assist now passes him for most assists on one team in the second period while on the power play. Yep. They find everything down to the most minute detail, and there's a list for it, and there's a statistical category for it, and I'm sure that will fit into one here at some point this season. Now, we've mentioned on multiple occasions that the Penguins are red hot. 7-2-1 in their last 10. Making it even more impressive is that a lot of those games are against teams that are, sitting favorably in the standings. They beat every single one of the top 3 teams in the Atlantic Division. On Tuesday, they took down the number 2 team in the Pacific Division. So they're not just playing well, they're playing well against good competition. So that's a great indicator that, hey, this Penguins team, whenever they're on their game, can compete with almost anybody. Now, maybe take out the Colorado Avalanche because that game was ugly. But outside of that, they've looked pretty good in almost every game they've played. And because of that, we want to play a little game of Name That Stat Line, Horwat. Because 1, we haven't done it in a while. And 2, we think it's a great vehicle to talk about some of these players and some things that are going on around the Pittsburgh Penguins. First and foremost, we got 3 names here. They are all stat lines from the last 10 games. So the Penguins' current run of success. Let's start out with this one. Leading the Penguins in scoring during this stretch, this player has 13 points, 7 goals, and 6 assists in the last 10 games.
The last 10. Okay, so it being 7 goals in the last 10 takes out a ton of players.
Yes.
Is it Rickard Rakell?
It is not Rickard Rakell. Rickard Rakell, I don't have his stat line, but he's also had a pretty successful last 10.
Yeah, I know he's leading the team in goals, and that's kind of where I went with that one. My second guess would be Michael Bunting.
It is not Michael Bunting. It is actually, if I can get this to work. Okay, Rickard Rakell's stat line is not coming up. Do you have one more guess, or do you want to just toss it to the L category?
One more shot. Is it Brian Rust?
It is. I mean, eventually you were going to get it whenever it was 13 points. But yeah, Brian Rust, the hat trick last Thursday certainly helps the case there. Not to mention the fact that he added on a couple of assists, had a big assist on Tuesday against the LA Kings, but 13 points for number 17 on the Pittsburgh Penguins, 7 goals in 10 games. Absolutely ridiculous stretch for Brian Rust, somebody who, listen, we've talked about being hot, being cold, being injured this season. If he can stay healthy, we always say it. He is a 30-goal scorer in this league. He just hasn't been healthy enough to get there. This year, maybe he does. I mean, this current stretch is helping make up for the fact that he missed so many games early in the season. Maybe he cuts himself back on that pace.
Perhaps he does. It'll be one of those things you just have to wait and see. I mean, I forget who had it. David Pagnotta had maybe that, teams have been or might be calling about Brian Rust for a deal. At the moment, the Penguins have no plans on asking him to waive his no move clause or no trade clause, whatever he has. You have to get specific with that after what Jacob Trouba did.
Yeah.
But at the moment they don't plan on asking him, and I don't think, for what it's worth, Brian Rust would ask to waive it this year or even agree to anything this season. Next year's a different story, but for now I don't see him going anywhere. So he has a great opportunity to regain that pace this season in Pittsburgh still, even if the wheels kind of fall off for the rest of the team. You hope he can at least stay at a pretty good level, because if the wheels do fall off, that's a heck of a trade piece this summer.
I want to see him do it. I want to see, for one season, get that 30 goal mark so we can say, hey, you're a 30 goal scorer in the NHL, because he has been for years. Those injuries have just kept him at 27, 28 goals. Right now he's on pace for 29.8 goals if you do the math out. So he's right there. He's towing that line. If he continues this stretch that he's been doing right now, he's gonna go way past as far as that pace. So Brian Rust is the first name on Name That Stat line. Let's go to the next one. 9 points in the past 10 games, 5 goals, 4 assists, and 5 of his 9 points coming on the man advantage. Can you name that stat line, Horwat?
On the man advantage. 9 points. Ooh, this power play's been weird too. Have I said the name already?
No, I don't believe you have.
Ooh. I should pull up the roster so I know who's on this dang team.
You better not pull up the stat lines, because then I'll be
going to Daily Faceoff's line combinations. Because the power play has been such a weird, quite thriving institution almost. Let me throw. Oh man, now I don't know. Let me throw Cody Glass out there.
Cody Glass does not have 5 goals. He has 1 goal on the season.
I am at a complete loss. Can I hear the stats one more time? The only thing I'm remembering now is 9 points.
He has 9 points, 5 goals, 4 assists in the last 10 games played, and 5 of his 9 points have come on the man advantage.
Okay. I haven't said the name yet. That's the part that's getting me. Who's even been in the lineup enough?
I don't think you're going in the right direction with this one.
It's not Sidney Crosby. Dude hasn't scored a goal since this whole thing started.
Yeah. He has 0 goals in 10 games.
Evgeny Malkin really hasn't scored in that time.
No, he has 1, I believe, or 2.
Wait. Should I look at the defense? Is it Kris Letang?
It is Kris Letang. I was like, you're saying a lot of forwards here. The surprise is it's Kris Letang. He's actually been lighting the lamp at a very, very large scale for a defenseman, especially having a great stretch here, really, since he was joined by Owen Pickering. I talked about it yesterday on Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live for a handful of minutes that pairing is working out very well, not just because Owen Pickering has played well, but because Kris Letang has kind of elevated his game to another level here in recent weeks. But that's where I wanted to go with this one after, getting to the name there. Do you like how the Penguins have kind of split up their power play units? Because it's been about a week or two now since they said, all right, well, Malkin and Crosby, we're going to separate them, and Malkin's going to have his own unit. Crosby's going to have his own unit. And it's kind of been a revolving door and a lot of mixing and matching throughout those times. I mean, Kevin Hayes was on power play 1 with Crosby, and now he's a healthy scratch. So do you like what you're seeing with the Penguins power play, where they're saying the unit and the scheme is what was going to make us successful? The players, we're just going to keep shuffling around.
I do kind of like what's going on with it. Mostly because it isn't change for change's sake. It's change where we're trying to get something going. And we watched most of last season. Yeah, they they made changes to it, but far too late. We can say that the coaching staff made those changes last season a bit too late in the game. It was, hey, we're like 30th in the league. Now we got to try and switch it up. No, the Penguins at this time around were in an experimental period. Like I mentioned last episode too, it's okay. We're going to make the changes, but we're also changing the scheme about things. We're going to see if other things breed success. And at the same time, we're going to keep changing. It's not going to be a stagnant, we're making this move and now these are the lines. No, it is, we're going to make these moves and hold on, we're going to do this move, there's do that move, this one, this and this and that one. That's it. It felt like it feels like it's flowing a little more under the new regime and under the new power play coaching staff whenever I say that, mostly because I'm forgetting their names completely all of a sudden. I don't know how I could, because it was
David Quinn
this year and
Todd Reardon
last year. Thank you. It's like I don't cover the team or anything. Yeah, but it feels a little bit better under David Quinn because there's more of, you're making these changes, but also A, there's success happening, number one, but also B, it just feels like it's flowing a little better. And you're seeing the results, and that's all that really matters. As opposed to who's out there on the ice, as long as the results are happening, and they are, and it's just felt much more fluid.
Yeah, if you look at the Penguins on the power play, they are now up to 13th on the man advantage with a 22.3% success rate. You're hoping they keep moving in the right direction. I'm not sure how much I like the splitting of the power plays. It's worked on one hand. On another hand, it feels like at some point it's a little bit of too much movement because Letang and Carlson have been separated. I believe it's been Letang with Grzelcyk for the most part, or Grzelcyk has been the one that's bouncing back and forth. But they put Letang and Carlson out there late in the game against LA on that power play, and, well, they nearly gave up a shorthanded goal together. So I think that at some point it kind of makes it hard to get into a rhythm. It kind of makes it hard to kind of feel out what your other line mates are going to do on that man advantage. And it can lead to those situations where in the biggest moment of the game, they nearly gave up a breakaway or a 2-on-1 and then ended up taking a penalty as a result and completely negating the power play in its entirety. So I think it's interesting. I like the fact that they're willing to try new things whenever they get into like a slight muck or a slight, when they stall out. They like to make those changes because, like you mentioned, last year it was, well, eventually they're going to figure it out. They're star players. Nothing needs to change. Eventually they're going to figure it out. And you turned around and you said, well, you're out of a playoff spot. They haven't figured it out. You're 32nd in the NHL. And now at the same time, the only thing you're changing is who's on the left flank. So I like the fact that they're willing to change things around to try to keep it fresh. But at some point, you need to slow down the carousel. You need to make sure that these guys get some time to be able to mesh together and see if it's actually working versus, hey, well, that's beginner's luck over and over and over again because you continue to change things. But all in all, as long as they're scoring, it's hard to be overly upset about it. And like we mentioned, 13th in the NHL is a massive upgrade from where they were at this point last season. So it's kind of hard to get on them too much about that. We got one more name for Name That Stat Line, and then we're going to talk about our unsung heroes. This player, I almost said the name, 9 points also in the last 10 games. There's actually 3 players on the Penguins that have 9 points in their last 10. We talked about one with Kris Letang. There's 2 more. This is one of them. 3 goals, 6 assists, and I will call him the unsung hero to keep it on brand with the episode of this turnaround.
Is this a name that I have?
You've mentioned this name before in this segment, yes.
And I don't want to go with the obvious for Carter Kell. Is it Michael Bunting?
It is Michael Bunting. And the reason I call him the unsung hero of this entire thing is when he flipped the switch and became the guy that we wanted him to be, the guy that we all saw late last year when the Penguins went 8-2-2 down the stretch and narrowly missed the postseason. He has been that guy over this stretch, and it is very evident as to why that's important for this team, why that's important for his line with Evgeny Malkin and with Phil Tomasino. I think he's been very, very good since he took those couple of scratches and kind of woke up on the season, and the points are starting to follow. 3 goals, 6 assists, but really, let's be honest there. Evgeny Malkin got credit for the goal. It did hit his stick, but that was Michael Bunting's goal all the way. So you can get 3.5 and 5.5. That's where I'll put it with Michael Bunting.
However you want to put it, regardless of the numbers, he has found his rhythm. He has found what made him a key piece to the run last year. He has found everything that the Penguins were looking for him to start this year. It still took a few games after his healthy scratch, after his benching, to sort of find the rhythm, find the groove. But better late than never to get there, and it came before the Penguins canned him one way or the other. So, the fact that we are able to have the discussion of at all that, hey, here's his production in the last 10 games compared to what he was doing to start the year. This is just a great step up for Michael Bunting. And you're right, definitely one of the unsung heroes of this recent stretch and could be the season if he keeps it up.
Yeah, and you mentioned, the goal scoring, the points, and comparing those. I think it's more than that. I mean, you look at last game, Malkin gets dumped down by the crease, and who's there to put the guy in the headlock? That's Michael Bunting. So he's stepping up for his players, which I know a lot of fans have been upset about the fact that, a lot of players, they don't really step up for each other anymore. And Michael Bunting is one of those that when he's playing, when he's feeling it, he's going to do that every single time. He did it for Malkin on Tuesday. He'll do it for everybody on the ice there. And I think that he's been a guy that between the whistles, during play, all the time, has just kind of elevated his game and become what you expect Michael Bunting to become. And the goals should come as no surprise that they follow suit whenever he's playing that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, if it is more than just the points in the production. It is the Michael Bunting style of play. There's no other way of putting it. He has that sort of grit. He has that sort of edge to his game that the Penguins desperately need at times. And thankfully it's not, one of Malkin, Crosby, or Letang having to take care of their own business. It is someone else. That's one of the reasons why, when we mentioned John Ludwig earlier, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to see him stay on the team. But Michael Bunting being there is at least going to help in that aspect a little bit.
Now, speaking of unsung heroes, Justin Schultz has officially retired from the NHL. This is something that we kind of saw coming. He signed with the Swiss League in the offseason. We had this conversation about what Justin Schultz meant to the 2016 and 17 Cup runs, him being an unsung hero of the Sidney Crosby era. But another congratulations to Justin Schultz on a terrific career, and he will always have the Boulevard of the Allies Walking on Sunshine meme that turned into a t-shirt that is currently in my closet. So shout out to Schultzy. And that brings us to a fun little subject to close out the show. You mentioned it before we got on air here and said, we haven't looked back at like Penguins history in a long time. And that's something that, listen, our show in the second year went through COVID. So there was no actual hockey to talk about. So we looked back a lot during those times. We haven't done it as much in recent history. So we're going to do it right now. Shout out to the Sidney Crosby Archives, by the way, on Twitter at 87 Crosby Career, because they put out their top 5 favorite Penguins unsung heroes yesterday. And I thought it's not a bad idea. So go check out the Sidney Crosby Archives on Twitter. They put out this. Actually, I'm going to save that. I'm going to save the one that they put out until after we put ours out here. But let's go with number 5. Number 5 unsung hero, just in your opinion, no era specific, of the Pittsburgh Penguins.
For sure. To be fair with my list, I have no particular order. So I will try and order these as quickly as I can. If I had to pick a 5, it would be Ron Hainsey. Not in Pittsburgh long, but boy, did he step up at the right time, considering Kris Letang was unable to play that entire playoff run. And, you needed someone to step up without your key defenseman, and it was Ron Hainsey. First stint in the playoffs ever, first Stanley Cup. Boom. You couldn't ask for something better from A, Ron Hainsey, or B, the rest of the team around him.
Yeah, everybody was going to remember that Game 5 goal where he made PK Subban, and I don't remember, I think it was James Neal.
I think it was James Neal.
Look very bad whenever he went coast to coast and turned into Paul Coffey for a second, leading to a goal in a blowout victory, but still a victory that needed to happen, obviously, en route to a Stanley Cup victory. My number 5 is going back to the 90s. I'm going to say number 5 is Tom Barrasso. I understand this guy's a Hockey Hall of Famer, so he's not unsung in its entirety, but I don't think he's talked about enough when it comes to the 91 and 92 teams. Everybody talks about the amazing forwards. Everybody talks about Paul Coffey. Everybody talks about basically everybody except Tom Barrasso. In fact, a lot of people talk about Frankie Pietrangelo more than they talk about Tom Barrasso, but Barrasso had a .919 save percentage in the 1991 playoffs, which is phenomenal. He was also 16-5 with a .907 save percentage in 92. The guy is a Hall of Famer, but I don't think he's talked about nearly enough. So he's number 5 on my unsung heroes list.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good choice. Sure, he's a Hall of Famer. Sure, you talk him up. Plenty of people do talk him up, and he had a lot of, he's had a lot of heat in his day, but you're right. He doesn't get talked about enough, and it doesn't help that he essentially lives in the shadow of Marc-Andre Fleury in terms of goaltending in Pittsburgh. But he set the standard for Fleury to break through completely. And that should get talked about more, and probably does now that he's a Hall of Famer, and that sort of bridge has been mended. But, you're right. It's a good choice overall, too.
Yeah, from the 90s back-to-backs to the 2010 back-to-backs, I'm going with Brian Dumoulin as my number 4 unsung hero. What he did for those Penguins teams, really since he came over in the Jordan Staal trade, the way he played throughout his entire career, you have to appreciate a guy that does the dirty work and doesn't ask for anything in return. The only time that he was really in the limelight was when he was chugging 4 beers at once after a Stanley Cup in 2016 up at SAP Center. But Brian Dumoulin was a very, very good player for a very long time for the Pittsburgh Penguins in a massive role. We're talking right now about, man, if they get rid of Marcus Pettersson, who's going to fill into that role? Brian Dumoulin was that guy for a decade plus in Pittsburgh, if not close to a decade plus in Pittsburgh, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for it.
I like that choice too. You can't go wrong with it. He's unsung because he didn't bring offense. He didn't bring the goal scoring. He didn't bring the power play abilities. No, he played defense. He played his role and did so very well for a long time. And there was a brief time there you could argue he was one of the best defensemen in franchise history in terms of pure defense, making sure the team is going to win games defensively. He did a great job of that.
What is your number 4?
Moving on to number 4 for me. Maybe a little less unsung, and I know this is a name we'll discuss, I'm sure, a couple times before this episode even ends. Matt Cullen. Because one key piece, or multiple key pieces to the Penguins back-to-back runs in 16 to 17 was just their depth. There was a lot of changes to it between year 1 and year 2. There was a lot of shifting of names, but one consistent and kind of the leader of the depth for both of those years was Matt Cullen, the veteran face coming in and securing and locking down that solid depth that the Penguins had. It was something they were able to thrive on and really lean on, and Matt Cullen was just the leader of it. So really, I would say for this answer for me, at least Matt Cullen is the representative of all those names that were down there. Eric Fair, Carter Rowney for a minute,
Tom
Kuhnhackl, Scott Wilson, and I'm forgetting a few more, I'm sure, but Matt Cullen was the representative and the consistent face for both of those years.
Moving on to number 3, this is a player that I would be surprised if you didn't put him on your list. TK48, Tyler Kennedy is 100% an unsung hero. Even when you're talking about that third line in 2009, I know everybody talks about Staal, Cook, and Kennedy, but a lot of the times it's Jordan Staal. A lot of times it's Matt Cook because of the way he played. Not enough is said about how good Tyler Kennedy was for those years in Pittsburgh.
Absolutely. And actually, I don't have him on my list. So good choice, because, what he brought to the team was everything you mentioned there and then some. There was just he was just one of those solid pieces for a scoring depth that it was a weird league at the time. And he certainly brought every inch of he can score when he hits the net. He can play gritty whenever he wants to, and was able to be a good piece for that run. All around great choice.
Now, what is your number 3?
I always pause. I don't know if you have more to say on it, but I didn't have him on my list because I tried to look back for a bunch of these. I know my first 2 were from recent, but these last 3 will be old names. I'm going to go with Mark Recchi. Now, again, definitely a big popular name when he was in Pittsburgh. Dude had a Hall of Fame career and wasn't in Pittsburgh for as long as many people remember. He only won the cup here in 91, went on to win a couple more times afterwards, but he led the team in scoring in 91. It helped that Lemieux was hurt for a lot of it. But Mark Recchi, for that season was crazy. I have to pull the numbers back up, but he had over 100 points. And by the way, second on the team in scoring that year was John Cullen, who got traded. Did that team really need to win the Stanley Cup? But yes, it was, if I'm not mistaken, that's the one that everyone looks at as the best team, right? Like the historically great Penguins team, because it had Paul Coffey on it. It had...
I think most people look at the 92-93 team as the best team to ever play, but they didn't win a cup. So
yeah. But I remember there was that that voting thing that the Penguins team, I forget, I think it was the 91 Pens team that lost to the Oilers. But yeah, Mark Recchi had 113 points in that season and obviously went on to help in a big way to secure the first cup in Pittsburgh. And, I think, like I said, he is obviously remembered fondly for coming back, many years later. But for what it's worth, just an unsung hero of the old generation and bringing the first cup to Pittsburgh and then helping form Sidney Crosby as a child still in many ways. So there's that little bit of extra bump for Mark Recchi and just a Hall of Fame player, Hall of Fame person for the team. And, I don't have too much more on it. Just the numbers, what he did for so long, and the two different generations of Penguins that he played with certainly speaks for itself.
Yeah, and with that, we'll go to number 2, and this is a name that is on the Crosby Archives on Twitter's list, and he's high on my list as well. And it's Mr. Elimination Game. It's Mr. Brian Rust. It's the Rustache. It's the Rusty Razor. Whatever you call him, he's been an integral part of the Pittsburgh Penguins for the past 8 seasons. And look no further than Game 7 in 2016 against the Tampa Bay Lightning. This guy has been, you talk about the kind of the epitome of what the Penguins want young players to kind of turn into and the path that they want young players to take. It's Brian Rust. He's the prototype for the Pittsburgh Penguins and for Mike Sullivan's system. So he's been really good. And honestly, he's gotten a lot of love. I mean, look no further than what we were talking about just about 10, 15 minutes ago, whenever we brought up him in the Name That Stat Line portion. But Brian Rust, number 2, Mr. Elimination, he is the guy that has been probably the 5th best player on the Penguins since he joined the Penguins. Or I wouldn't go that far because he joined the Penguins as a 4th liner, but since he kind of took off with the Penguins in that 2016 playoffs.
Yeah, you could argue he's pretty high up there even since then. I mean, he made his presence known pretty quickly, and I like that choice as well. I'm going to move over to mine here as the number 2, and that's Hall of Famer Joey Mullen. Again, an absolutely always forgotten name in Pittsburgh history, or in Penguins history, because he was picked up as a Stanley Cup champion from the Calgary Flames and was a veteran addition. It's not like he was there to bring the high-flying goal scoring or the playmaking. He was there just as a veteran addition to be a depth piece, and he did just that with, helping secure the first cup in 91, helping with the second with 87 points, by the way, 91-92. Wasn't his career year, but for 34-year-old Joey Mullen, that's not bad. And like I said, Hockey Hall of Famer, well-deserved, and got 2 more cups to his name thanks to being a veteran presence in the Penguins lineup back then.
Yeah, there were so many names on those 91-92 teams where you look back. I mean, I remember watching throughout most of my childhood. Now I just throw on YouTube and throw on, Pittsburgh is home and enjoy it. But we had the VHS tapes of the 91-92 teams. I wish I remembered the title of the one. It was actually about the 1989-90 team, and that was my favorite. It was kind of like the building blocks of what became the back-to-back Stanley Cup champions. So Joey Mullen, obviously a big part of those early 90s teams, and I love his inclusion in this list. Well, we have our number 1 remaining, and you mentioned a little earlier about Mark Recchi being part of the group that formed young Sidney Crosby. I don't think this player is talked about enough because he didn't play in Pittsburgh very long. He was a trade deadline acquisition in 2009. He played in 2010. Then he retired. And most people now just know him as the assistant GM of the 16-17 team and now the general manager of the Minnesota Wild. Number 1 unsung hero, Billy Guerin. I mean, his impact on young Sidney Crosby was massive during that 2009 stretch to help push the Penguins over the finish line. 15 points in 24 games in the 09 playoffs. Somebody that, if you think back to the 09 playoffs, you probably don't remember any, or you can't pick out any Bill Guerin goals. And if you can, you're probably a sicko, and I'd probably love to sit down and have a beer with you. But Bill Guerin was truly just a player's player, and he's carried that over into a successful front office career. But I think he's a player that a lot of people, I mean, probably because he only played a season and a quarter with the Penguins, but I think what he did during his playing career, specifically in Pittsburgh, deserves a lot of praise.
If I'm not mistaken, he had a big overtime goal during that run, so I do remember. a Bill Guerin goal from that playoff run. So there you go. Thankfully, we've had plenty of beers together. But yeah, good choice. An extremely underrated choice because he wasn't here that long. And I think that is really what lays the groundwork for that being just a magnificent choice. And yeah, that is the only goal I can remember from Bill Guerin, though. So you got me there. I'm going to cap mine off with not a Stanley Cup winner. But again, I wanted to pull into the history for this one because of the unsung hero.
Brandon Sutter.
So close to winning, but he didn't. But an unsung hero for just the franchise as a whole, in terms of its history, in terms of everything it brought, Rick Kehoe. I mean, he set the numbers that Mario went on to break. Like we mentioned, Barrasso set the standard for goaltending. Rick Kehoe was the Penguin back then. I mean, he didn't surpass Jean Pronovost in goals, but he had every other offensive stat essentially. He's still 6th all-time in points behind the obvious names.
Yeah.
The Lemieux, Crosby, Malkin, Yager, and Letang. And then it's Rick Kehoe with 636. So he set the standard for Penguins offense. Like I said, he didn't win a cup, but has been a key figure in the organization, as a player and then as a front office face or a coaching staff face. I forget what he did, but he's been around for a long time and he's always been, pretty well known as a Pittsburgh Penguin and, set the standard for everything that Mario went on to crush. And that's just one of those things that can't be forgotten in the history because you always wonder who did these greats break the numbers from. You always know Gretzky broke all of Hal's records, essentially. Lemieux broke all of Kehoe's records in this franchise.
Yeah. So that's our top 5. Mine is Tom Barrasso at number 5, Brian Dumoulin at number 4, Tyler Kennedy at number 3, Brian Rust at number 2, and Billy Guerin at number 1. I actually have a couple honorable mentions. I'm not going to get into it. Max Talbot, I want to throw on this list, but at the same time, I'm like, is he unsung? I feel like enough people have sung his praises for scoring 2 goals in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final in 2009. So I'll give him a little bit of love here, but I don't necessarily think he's an unsung hero. And then Pascal Dupuis, I think, is somebody that fits perfectly into that category, but I just don't have him in my top 5. And can you remind the folks at home what your top 5 was?
I will just read down the list I had because it was in no particular order. I'll try to here. I had Ron Hainsey, Matt Cullen, Joey Mullen, Mark Recchi, and Rick Kehoe. I think I flipped Recchi and Mullen, but I didn't have an order here. And if I had to pick an honorable mention, I was just looking for the name because I forgot. Pierre LaRouche. Again, one of those older names that you kind of forget about, but truly was so much of the Penguins back in those days, especially for LaRouche in those ugly, ugly years.
Yeah, and one last shout out to the Sidney Crosby Archives on Twitter who had Ruslan Fedotenko, another great name, as an honorable mention. Same with Max Talbot. But I had Matt Cullen at number 5, Peter Nedved at number 4, Phil Bourque, the old 2-9er at number 3, Trevor Daley, another very good choice at number 2, and Brian Rust at number 1. Again, shout out to the Sidney Crosby Archives on Twitter, and shout out to you for listening to this episode of The Tip of the Ice-Burgh. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this one. Remember, you can find us on YouTube at Tip of the Ice-Burgh, or you can check us out anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.